Go. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Ravlic and I'm the founder of Ravim RBC. I'm a local government tragic, having worked in and around the sector since 1982. I work with councils around the country on a range of projects, including transitioning to net zero. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the past and present traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the lands upon which we meet. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, their ancestors and their families. I'm joining today's session from the land of the Wurundjeri people. In terms of the webinar protocol, please have your microphones muted and your video turned off during the presentations. During the Q&A panel session, participants will be invited to unmute their microphone and turn on their cameras when asking their questions or making a contribution to the discussion. So that we don't miss your input, please use the raise your hand function and we'll throw to you to participate. Participants will also have the option to type in their questions using the Teams Q&A function. This session will be recorded. And it will be made available as a resource to the sector. This is the program for the day. Please note that we've allowed plenty of time for questions and discussions at the conclusion of the presentations. The NetZero Roundtable is designed to fast-track council and community progress towards net zero by promoting successful sustainability initiatives. We want to encourage replicability of successful sustainability initiatives. With the election of the Albanese government, there is a renewed enthusiasm in tackling climate change. Building on Morrison's net zero target of 2050, the Albanese government legislated the midterm target of 43% and adopted the safeguard mechanism, which requires the nation's heaviest polluters to reduce and or offset their emissions by 4.9% per annum. For some time, it felt like not everyone was on board with the Paris commitments and our national net zero targets. Much of this has changed with the new government and the stronger messaging that's coming out of Canberra. Investors in publicly listed companies are demanding more frequent votes on climate plans. Dissatisfied with emission reduction strategies, investors are sending warnings that they will vote against remuneration reports and re-election of directors because there is no direct opportunity to vote on the company's climate plans. Some companies are putting these non-binding matters to their shareholders every 3 years, unless there's been substantial change. Last year, 8 companies gave their shareholders a vote on their climate plans, up from just 1 in 2021. Companies are coming under increasing pressure to give their investors an annual non-binding vote on their climate strategies. Commitments are being made to achieve emission reductions by certain dates. Strategies and action plans are required to realise these commitments. Shareholders want to monitor their company's progress against these commitments and compare against industry benchmarks. Before I introduce Gillian, Gillian, could you get ready to share your screen shortly?
Sure.
Planning for net zero is quickly becoming mainstream, and similar to publicly listed companies, councils will be called upon by their communities to respond appropriately to the net zero challenge by capturing their direction in the form of net zero plans. One such council that recently finalised their organisational zero net emissions plan is Sunshine Coast Council. And with us this afternoon, we have Gillian Smith, who's the Coordinator of Sustainability Policy. Welcome, Gillian.
Thanks, John. And thanks for inviting Sunshine Coast Council to be part of this discussion. We're always happy to hear what others are doing, and if we have anything of value to impart that where we can. So just bear with me while I share. Is that coming up okay?
Looks good.
All good. Hi everyone. Look, I'm Jill, and I am beaming in from the Sunshine Coast Council, which is located within southeast Queensland and is home to the Kabi Kabi or Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnabara nations. I too pay my respects to the elders past, present and yet to come of the Jinnabara and Kabi Kabi peoples, and acknowledge their enduring custodianship and ongoing knowledge of the lands we share within our local government area. Today, it's my pleasure to share with you a bit about the emissions reduction journey our organisation has taken over the last couple of years. And this is fully acknowledging that probably there's going to be a different pathway to that for as many different councils as there are, based on your context, your size, the political support that you have at the moment. I'm also aware that there are probably some councils online who have actually already reached carbon neutrality, and I take my hat off to you and kudos for achieving that, and perhaps we can learn a few golden nuggets from you during this presentation as well, or through the webinar and Q&A. So look, before I get started, just what I'll be travelling through today with you is some of the key things that we think is useful to have in place before developing a net zero plan, some critical elements needed to develop a successful plan. I'll provide you with a wee look at what our zero net emissions plan looks like, and finish up by sharing some key takeaways and what we've learned along the way through the multi-year process. So first up, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Sunny Coast, but we are one of the larger local governments in Queensland and Australia, serving a community of about 350,000 residents currently, increasing to well over 500 by 2041. And that is across an area of just under 2,300 square kilometres, made up of 60 k's of open beaches, 124,000 hectares of native veg, around 3,500 kilometres of rivers and creeks. We have a really diverse economy with the gross regional product estimated at 18.5 billion for 2021. We're very much a community of communities with distinct characteristics and identities. And we're also a community who's really embraced renewables, with more than 55% of all dwellings within our local government area having rooftop solar. We also have several major regional projects on the go, including development of a new greenfield CBD in Maroochydore. And in fact, the building on the top left is the new City Hall, owned by council, and this is where I'm talking from today. And that is developed, in line with I think a 5-star rating. So we're very happy to be part of here, and it's got lots of lovely green plants cascading down it. So it's quite a beautiful building. We have got the expansion of our airport to accommodate international travellers, and we have 2 emerging residential development fronts accommodating in excess of 100,000 new residents. And we're also planning for a mass transit solution to accommodate the extra population efficiently. Look, as with I suspect many of you on this webinar, we're certainly grappling with how to manage unprecedented growth and development while also protecting our natural environment and livability. This includes how to manage increasing emissions, let alone reducing them, across the range of services we deliver for our community. And for Sunshine Coast Council, we actually deliver over 100 external facing service delivery activities, so it's pretty complex. Like the proverbial, cat herding approach, given the complexity and diversity of work local governments do, I think it's fair to say that emissions reduction planning can feel a bit overwhelming, and I think that's certainly true of what we've felt, at various times over the past few years. That said, there are a couple of things we found really useful to do prior to developing our emissions reduction plan, and we think, maybe they might work for you too if you haven't yet embarked on this. Firstly, have a clear vision and integrated policy regarding sustainability, climate change and emissions reduction. With respect to our climate change response, the Environment and Livability Strategy, which is the one highlighted in the middle, has a number of our relevant policy positions and specifies the target of being a zero net emissions organisation and low carbon community by 2041. These policy positions and targets have been carried through to our corporate plan and strategic risk register, which in turn drives organisational wide action. So there are a couple of things really useful to have in place if you haven't already. Secondly, if you haven't done so, start measuring your carbon footprint and emission sources. There is plenty of free guidance about how to do this, including understanding the methodology reporting requirements. And thirdly, start getting your data sources in order. The next step, we think that's really critical, is to understand how to create connected and integrated action by building on what's already been achieved. So, like many of you, I'm sure you're already undertaking a multitude of actions that either save money, they encompass renewables, or they are actually having an emissions reducing effect. For us, we have been taking action in various ways since around about 2010, and some of the key ones include our 15 megawatt solar farm, which is actually a utility scale solar farm and offsets around about 100% of our electricity usage. We do landfill gas flaring and capture. We've been doing that for a number of years. We have been installing efficient HVACs and building management systems, and we have had hybrids and some EVs in the past, but certainly there's more to do around that. Now, the key thing for these great projects in of themselves were that they were largely designed and developed as one-off or standalone projects, which generally meant that emissions reduction was achieved more through good luck than through good planning. The activity was not occurring as efficiently or effectively as it could be if it was linked to other projects, thereby foregoing some substantial cost savings or opportunities to generate income. And this is in particular to the installation of renewables and linked to demand management and energy optimization strategies. We also weren't really capturing the great work already being done by others, and this pretty much had the impact of dissipating the knowledge that could be shared with others and to champion change. So that was actually pretty crucial that we started joining all things together. So from here, we reckon with some of that pre-planning in place, you should be in a pretty good position to start developing an emissions reduction plan. So at that point for us, that meant that we actually brought in some expertise, and we did use 100% renewables, who are pretty good specialists in this area with respect to emissions reduction planning. So we worked with 100% renewables to confirm that our 2041 target, which we actually identified back in 2017, was still appropriate as per the science-based targets approach aligned to the Paris Agreement. We also worked with our consultant to align our inventory to the climate active standards. So even though we'd been doing this ourselves and aligning to the international greenhouse gas protocols, we actually wanted to take the next step and actually align to the climate active standards. So it actually made it ready, or we would be ready whenever we chose to actually do the certification process. And I'm aware that there are some of you that have already achieved that certification. And the consultant also worked with us to help map our emissions reduction trajectory with known or planned actions. So it's actually, with respect to this slide, is one of the critical outputs developed with our consultant. And this was actually key to facilitating understanding across our organisation of what needed to be done by when. So just a couple of things to note. We did map the business as usual emissions scenario that was likely to apply and that we could expect to see if no additional emissions reduction measures were made to what we were currently doing. And this effectively would see a steady increase in our emissions as our population grew. So it was definitely driven by increasing population as a key factor. What we then did was identified plausible emissions reducing measures aligned to our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions sources. And that included looking at grid decarbonisation, which is in Queensland largely up to the state to do. We included our hybrid transition to a hybrid and electric vehicle fleet. We also included other fuel reducing measures for other plant and other equipment. Includes fleet reduction or fleet streaming, which several of you are probably doing as well. We do actually have a relatively large fleet compared to other sort of municipal councils, and it's because of we are regionally based, and there is a lot of travelling that's required to undertake core services. The other one really is street lighting. So we mapped this, and that would be updating to change over to high efficiency LEDs. And then also looking at renewable energy PPAs for assets and for our streetlight contracts as well. But a big one is really linked to the reduction in emissions we will get from increasing flaring and capture of the gas, and then to generate renewable energy, particularly at one of our landfill sites up in Nambour. And then hand in hand with that was actually the introduction of FOGO, or Food Organics and Garden Organics program. And that has already kicked off with the introduction of the Garden Organics component. Now, I'll just run through a few of these other things that were mapped and I'll talk to them in a minute. So just a couple of things, as I've mentioned previously. Waste is definitely our biggest emissions source because we own and manage 2 active landfills, and that includes community waste. So we incorporate that as part of our operational control in our organisational emissions boundary, which does make things a wee bit challenging. It's also, as a result, our biggest opportunity for emissions reduction. We now have a really good idea of what actions provide what quantum of emissions reduction by when. And it's also highlighted that we still have a rather large bit of work to do, and that's actually denoted by the white gap in between what our pathway is on that top dotted line to the percentage decrease we need to achieve to meet the science-based target aligned with the Paris Agreement, but also to meet carbon neutrality by 2041. The dark green triangle is actually the amount that's left, and that essentially relates to what we would have to purchase in offsets if we actually wanted to become carbon neutral and we couldn't identify any further emissions reducing activities. So obviously that's a bit probably likely to be quite costly by the time we get to 2041. So certainly a priority for council is really ploughing in investments into emissions reducing activities. So this, I think, can't be underestimated, and we've really learned that this is the most critical element determining how successful an emissions journey or emissions reduction planning will be, because the extent to which your colleagues are with you, feel part of the process, and ultimately own your zero net emissions plan is critical. And that's because climate change, whether it's adaptation planning or emissions reduction, is essentially a change management process. And we are reliant on other business areas within council to implement. So it also requires a fundamental shift to current ways of working. You're probably well aware that, councils, like other levels of local government and probably big organisations, there's a tendency to silo and to go back to what you know. This isn't going to work when we're actually working with systemic issues like climate change and emissions reduction. We need to ensure it's embedded and integrated across a number of business units, systems and decision-making processes. So to put this into perspective for us, this is the process we ran in council, and it took us around 20 5 minutes, 20 months. So as you can see, there's extensive engagement was undertaken. We had multiple touch points with councillors and with our senior management team, focus groups, and we really got traction in November 2021 when our council called a climate emergency resolution, and that really accelerated action. So it's really important to get that high level support, you know, not only from your elected reps, but also from your senior leadership team. So we now have a plan, and it covers 6 key focus areas, providing actions over a 5-year rolling implementation plan. Very deliberately, we put governance and culture change as the first focus area, for the very reasons outlined previously, and the other focus areas of our plan is aligned to our key emission sources. We have aligned our plan to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've done this for a couple of reasons. In June 2022, our local government area received international recognition as UNESCO Biosphere, and part of this recognition is a requirement to report against the UN SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. So it made sense then to, you know, follow that through to other levels of planning and policy pieces of work. It also provides a really useful framework for others across council to understand how their business areas relate to broader sustainability goals, including emissions reduction. Look, this is just a bit of a quick look at the format and structure of the plan. For each of the focus areas outlined previously, we pull through the relevant sustainable development goals. There's an overarching outcome statement, 3 pathways for action, where the associated integrated emissions reduction activities are aligned under, and then interim targets for 2025 and 2030 to ensure we're keeping on track. So this is what it looks like for waste, electricity, and then this is actually the 5-year rolling implementation plan, identifying the key actions, the time frame for implementation, relative cost, and then the lead branch or branches across council. And we say branches deliberately because it's a way to integrate and drive integration and embedding. And I am trying to scoot through this. So just a small discussion point about sequestration. We have included this in our zero net emissions plan too, and this is actually leveraging off the work we're working on with respect to climate adaptation. And in this case, we actually have some significant areas that will be impacted by tidal inundation over the next 80 years. So again, provides a really good opportunity as the landscape transitions from a land to a brackish or an inland waterway. We can actually identify opportunities for new carbon sequestration activities, in this case, carbon sequestration from blue carbon mangroves, that sort of thing. And we are working with the federal government and the Queensland government, as well as 2 universities, to better understand the phasing of how that sequestration occurs, and providing new economic opportunities, not only for council, but for the affected landholders. Very quickly, data is really important. You really need to get your ducks in a row, or your balls all bouncing in the same, in the same line with respect to data. And wrangling this was actually a bit of a mission for us, as we are a very large organisation. And the original data collected, they weren't actually really collected for the purposes of sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions reporting. So there was a bit of adjustments that we had to do, to make the data actually fit for purpose. So pretty much a year ago, this is what our data capture process looked like. Highly manual, all over the place, based on different data types. But I'm pleased to say over the last year, we've been working on collating the organisational data across our enterprise level data management platform. So it automates it, cleanses it, ingests it, making it available not only for us, but for other business areas of council. So it's now much more ordered, integrated and useful. And now it also allows us to do automated reporting, sustainability reporting over multiple years. And that will be utilised via a Power BI platform that others within council can use. So final slide. So after all that, what have we learned through the process? Key ones for us is that understand that it's primarily a culture change process, and that actually really changes the way you look at things and actually understand how you develop solutions. It's definitely a systems approach that's required. As I said, it is process driven, and also really look at it as a business improvement process. If you do that, you will absolutely get traction. rather than just focusing on an environmental issue. That's what we've found for our purposes, and I think it probably would work generally. Look, start from wherever you're at within council, identify your great initiatives, start pulling them together and get your colleagues on side, share their good work. You want to actually create a core of staff who will work with you to take this information forward. You've got to have your senior level support, both political and internal management. This will absolutely accelerate action. Business integration is critical. Work with those who know their business, because they'll likely have the answers and insights to the barriers and why emissions reduction is not being prioritised in the first place. And for God's sake, show the value proposition, that is saving money, earning income, realising co-benefits. And if you can help them improve the data sets and then provide that back to them, they will want to work with you more. Bring in expertise when you need it. Don't try and struggle through this. Some of these aspects of emissions reporting are complex. And I think lastly, there's so much value in joining alliances, working with other local governments, access grants and leverage. And I think I'll leave it there.
Gillian, thank you so much.
Now I just need to unshare.
All good. Thank you, Gillian. I'll just do a quick intro for Wayne. Wayne, I hope you're ready to go shortly.
Awesome. Yep.
Recent developments in the carbon offset space are not positive. We've had a few councils caught up with some questionable schemes. Many councils striving to achieve their annual emission reduction targets will do so with carbon offsets. This means they'll dip into their bank account. To extend their purchasing power, some councils have been driven to consider and procure carbon offsets overseas. It appears that overseas offsets are cheaper than local offsets. We have Wayne Westcott with us this afternoon, who will walk us through the what, why and how of carbon offsets. Wayne's the CEO of Greenfleet, one of the few suppliers of carbon offsets that continues to pass the scrutiny currently being applied. Welcome, Wayne.
Right, thank you, John. I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the opportunity to present today. So let me just go back though, we don't want that. Excellent. Okay, there we go. Is that all kosher? Can we see?
Good to go.
Yep, good to go. Okay, thank you. So thank you, John. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate the opportunity, you and Jenny, to speak. I'm not a local government tragic as you describe yourself, but as you note, I was at the City of Port Phillip and was the founder of Bickley here, Local Governments for Sustainability, way back in the day. And if I can just pause for 1 second, listening to Gillian talking, then I have to one of the things that the local government sector does well is coordinate across geography, but not necessarily across time. And I think it would be really good to recognise that, we had these conversations 20, 25 years ago. We did corporate and community, as we then call them, carbon accounts. We went through the energy waste transport levers that local governments had, and in fact had these debates, not using the terms net zero emissions, but at a time when there was still a battle going on, but which we were winning well through the early noughties, until we ran into the roadblock of Tony Abbott and all the rest. So I just want to point out that there's been a long history of good grief, I don't know why this is doing this. There's been a long history of climate action that I've been involved in with local governments over many years. So a little bit about Greenfleet first, just so you know who's talking here. So that's essentially what we do. Is we are the second wave of the environment movement. The first wave is all about conservation, and that's a critical component of our work. In the environment movement, that's not what Greenfleet does. Greenfleet is part of the restoration movement. So what we do is take those areas that have been cleared, of which we know in our country in particular there are extensive swathes of it, and we seek to restore in an intelligent, smart way the ecosystems that were there before the clearing. And we do that in multiple ways, and it's one of great interest, I think, to all of us who try to align the environmental movement with other sectors. We're doing a lot of work with agricultural sectors, increasing productivity on farms, but obviously one key area is the role of carbon sequestration. Greenfleet really has three key focuses. As an organisation, we remove carbon, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a minute, but we remove carbon from the atmosphere. That's a critical component. We restore nature. That's the way we go about removing carbon. And we work very closely with traditional owners. So we seek to advance Indigenous reconciliation where we can. We're a not-for-profit. We understand that there's many legacies and challenges in that, but for example, in Gillian's area, we signed an Indigenous land use agreement with Kabi Kabi in the area, to a project around Noosa, which is benefiting directly them as they go through the native determination process, which in fact they're doing right at this very moment. So I think the key thing I just want to really emphasise here is that the work we do is focused on long-term climate action. And I'm going to come back to this as we go through a bit of a discussion about where we've got to in my sector. I'm a big one on what we call permanence, which is effectively carbon agreements for up to 100 years. And that's something that is really key, and something obviously, Gillian, you would be thinking about in terms of blue carbon, because that's a bit of an issue with permanence around that. The opportunity, though, is for us to do a whole lot of the things that we've been talking about again in the environment for many years, the multiple ways that restoring ecosystems benefits our community in multiple ways. I don't think, looking at the attendee list, I need to go on about this, because I think many of you are engaged right in the middle of this sort of work. Happy to talk to any of you offline about that if that's useful. And this is just a sense of the numbers have totally disappeared, have they? That's exciting. So we won't worry about that too much. Excellent. Yeah. One of those. So we have, we've had a big impact because we've been going for 25 years, and I think that's probably important. That's one of the reasons why my supporters want to work with us. That's the introduction. That's who's talking to you. I should identify that we're probably on one end of the carbon offsets sector as an industry. We are a group that is not only we're the only not-for-profit doing it at scale, because so much of our industry has been had a heavy funding of the sector, but we also emphasise morality and ethics in the work we're doing. So just a quick overview here. I actually think, again, knowing the attendees at this call, I think you'll all be aware of this. You understand what carbon offsets, I'm assuming, are simply a way to have a quantifiable approach to compensate for the emission of carbon dioxide. Now, typically, it's usually seen as traded as part of a commercial scheme. That obviously isn't required. At Greenfleet, we focus on purchase and retirement, and that's something that's really important, which I'll go into in a minute. But the danger is otherwise that commercial schemes have a way of getting a lot of people involved who aren't necessarily interested in the outcome other than making money. Carbon offsets have a couple of different approaches. I break them down really into two: carbon removal and carbon avoidance. So carbon avoidance, typically, avoid an activity that will increase carbon emissions. And the classic one of that would be, avoided deforestation. So as we all know, deforestation is still legal in this country. In other countries, this is a critical element, and carbon avoidance is really important, especially in the subtropics. Carbon avoidance focusing on avoiding carbon in the future. But carbon removal is the really exciting part, I think, of carbon offsets. It's pretty much, I think, accepted that for a net zero target of 2050, we need something like 500 gigatons of equivalent CO2 removed from the atmosphere by 2100 to get there, to keep our increase under 2 degrees. And I know there's a lot of other debates about 1.5, but even 2 degrees is going to have a massive removal requirement. And so what globally they often talk about as negative emissions, we call carbon removal. And I think that one of the great technologies that carbon removal has is planting trees, restoring forests, and that's what we focus on. There are 2 markets in globally around using carbon offsets, compliance and voluntary. Now, this is a slightly simplified version. There is a little bit of a blurred area, but for the purposes of this. And we know that we've just had a recent focus, as John outlined, with the safeguard mechanism. The compliance market, typically in a compliance market, a requirement to buy offsets to meet certain other targets will focus on price. That's very typically the case, and probably that's not a bad thing, though it has its issues. And secondly, in a voluntary market, the focus is typically on quality, and that's where Greenfleet works. We work in the voluntary market. The voluntary market, the range of rationales will not be because, okay, we're required to do this. It will be, as for many of you in local government, will be because there's, if I could call it, business value from, top to bottom, which might be, from the councillors, senior management and staff, all of whom have a certain values that they might want to attribute to this. It will be supply chains, community activists and local ratepayers, businesses, etc. All of which, for which there might be a business value in being involved in this. Now, given we're talking net zero emissions, you've already jumped over that, but I think it's important to state that that's still very strong. And I've noticed in Greenfleet that over the last couple of years, going through and being now post-COVID, I'm not sure if we're allowed to say that, but being in this position now, having gone through that process, or the worst of it maybe, or the unprotected component of it. I'm not sure how we say this, John, but I think the focus now is that we're getting a lot more people who have had a bit of a reset of values as well, and I'm getting a lot of private sector companies coming to us talking about how they can get involved. So just before we jump into the next step here, why do we need carbon offsets? I've just discussed there. They're really one part of this formula. As really Gillian's graph described, and we've got 1 million of those of companies that are using this over time. We all know that the ethics of this must be that all efforts are made to reduce emissions where possible. We also know that's a transition process. It can't be done in one go. And many things will take some time, or actually are beyond our sphere of control. And local government over many years has demonstrated that within their sphere of control, there's a lot they can do. But of course, things like energy infrastructure, although that's changing, I think, are a little bit more awkward and difficult. So I think there it's a case of trying to make sure that carbon offsets are still part of the larger formula. Now, why is that important? Because essentially, as John mentioned, we've had a pretty terrible midterm report on what is happening with carbon offsets. As you know, there's been the Australia Institute in particular has driven a lot of work over the last, I guess, 12 to 18 months, talking about the key methodologies under the Emission Reduction Fund. And I'm assuming everyone's up with all of this, but I just want to outline it. Which would be avoided deforestation being the first one, which was widely seen by the industry as greenwash from the very beginning, but was very effectively marketed. So apologies for any of you who are directly involved in that, but it was a particularly difficult one. Methane from landfills, that's something that councils have some control of, and has been again a battleground since I was at the council. So there's been a lot of work done on that. As you know, the key issue there was really the baselines were being inflated, and thirdly, human-induced regeneration, which is a change of management practice and which now dominates the ERF, which I see, I'm sorry to say this, and I'm sure my colleagues will disagree in the sector, but I see as largely greenwash because there's a lack of permanence. So that's in Australia. We've also got, of course, many of you would have seen the Four Corners report on the Vera project in PNG. South Pole also got stung by the calculations they were making on a large avoided deforestation project as well globally. So what that's meant for all of us who are in the industry is that there's been incredible downturn in trust and a real sense that, you know, what are we buying here? And I think that's a legitimate response. And my view would be that we very much need to recover that. Again, happy to talk more about any of that as we go. So what does this mean for councils? Councils have been involved in carbon offsetting. Many of you clearly have been for many years. I still remember, I think it was the City of Wellington in New Zealand back in the day, so it would have been about 2003, 2004, making, I'm stand to be corrected, making a commitment to being the first carbon neutral local government in the Southern Hemisphere. I think was how they put it. And then they realised that they hadn't really done the numbers, and they discovered that it was $6 to $7 million a year, which no one had kind of made that connection. So there was quite a lot of consternation behind the scenes as they tried to work out how to do it. And I think that this is not an uncommon thing. Local governments, like businesses, are wary of making target calls if they feel they can't achieve them realistically. Dependence on carbon offsets has been used in the past, usually cheap ones, as John mentioned, and in particular, that's an issue for local government because, of course, for businesses, especially global businesses, they can demonstrate that they have an impact and a supply chain around the world. Local governments typically will struggle to demonstrate that investing beyond their catchment, or at least, if not their own borders, is easy. Now, in this case, I think there's legitimate reasons, but I just want to make the point that I think you're in a particular vice with this one, which makes it very difficult. And I think we need to be more creative around it. But carbon offsets clearly are going to be a continued part of the game. And some of you are already well and truly deeply into this, so I really have nothing more to say. But those of you who are coming into it maybe need to think about how local governments can use carbon offsets. Again, Gillian mentioned Climate Active. Climate Active also has been going through some very difficult political times, as probably most of you know. The Climate Active is the government approved carbon neutral program, and I think has all the elements you need to make it work. Absolutely, it's got an auditable process, and I'm not unhappy with any of that. It's understaffed, and it lacks the ability to do due diligence broadly enough, in my view, and that creates weaknesses which can be exploited. And clearly, given the Climate Active was, so we've offset with Sydney Opera House locally in Australia, but they have also been buying some overseas stuff, and they got caught out in that Vera PNG problem as well. Councils will also not only use a program like that, but also look at really hard to reduce elements. Again, picking up, I think it was waste that you were talking about, Gillian. Typically, local governments will want to get started on something, even though there's a plan. It's a very long-term plan, and typically councils want to see some action early on. I'm a strong advocate of finding things that we define as hard to reduce and starting to offset them, so at least there's some kind of way of making a difference with the impact right now, rather than waiting for another 20 years. And as I say, short-term actions that are well thought through can help inspire community action as well. So, yep. Just thinking now about finally, just thinking about criteria that you might want to think about and discuss in this session. I think firstly, think about carbon removal, not avoidance. Your emission reduction work, which will be happening in energy waste and transport, typically are big things to make a difference. Carbon removal should be on the top of your list for carbon offsets. It's worthwhile focusing on permanence. What we don't want is, and this is my main critique of the emission reductions fund, is we don't want a whole series of reversals mid-century when things come off contract and we have thousands of hectares out west of Queensland or New South Wales that suddenly get regrazed and all the benefits of holding carbon are reversed. That would be the worst possible thing. We need a transition to a low carbon economy to happen through this century. And so my view is strongly that permanence has to be right front and central. Local implementation, this is probably a wish list one, to be honest, because we all know how hard this is. But we've worked with some councils to plant locally, and I still think there's a way of doing that. If we could work out a way to essentially move that into a virtuous circle where offsets are done locally against properly calculated natural ecosystems, then I think there's a real possibility to do something there. There's got to be a lot of due diligence. You know all of this. Councils are actually pretty good at this, but due diligence in my field means probably someone going and having a look. And I think that's often very difficult and costly. But I mean, I think we need to work out a way to increase authenticity, because so much of what we're seeing, especially overseas emission offsets, are struggling to demonstrate they're authentic. And I guess my last one actually picks up again what Julian was saying about looking at multiple kind of impacts. I'm a strong believer that that we bringing things together means that we can meet multiple policy objectives at the same time. And the work we're doing in Noosa is an example of that, where we're both benefiting kabi, we're directly planting koala habitat and providing a linkage, and also sequestering 700 to 750,000 tonnes of carbon. So there's an opportunity to do a great deal in one particular approach. So I might leave it there and have and focus on questions afterwards, John.
Thank you, Wayne. Michael, I'll get you to get ready if that's okay. The CT Management Group are trusted advisors to the local government sector. With a network of experienced local government professionals, CT continues to advise councils on a range of contemporary topics and challenges. Known for their cutting-edge work with asset management, CT wants to bring a similar discipline to councils preparing to deal with their net zero challenge. Michael Courtney, CT's Managing Director, will propose the development of a net zero assessment framework to identify and benchmark councils' capacity and capability to achieve net zero. Good afternoon, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you very much, John. Just get this thing start sharing. Yeah, everyone see that?
Excellent, thank you.
All right. Just a little bit about CT management. We started about 27 years ago. We operate up and down the east coast of Australia. We offer, I suppose, retiring or people transitioning to retirement opportunity to work as associates. And we also have many younger consultants joining us, you know, particularly post-COVID. People are reevaluating work ethic and, you know, how much time they want to spend at work. So we give people flexibility, and we focus our associates on delivery in our key areas: asset management, service planning, financial sustainability. We do a lot of placements, etc. Now, net zero is not one of our, or sustainability is not one of our strengths, but we bring the flavour I want to bring today is, I suppose, really around a little bit of what Gillian said about this change management process, and also, I suppose, getting a sector-wide assessment of where we're at, because I think Wayne also talked about this issue around borders, and when you think about it, local government borders don't have much to do with emissions, do they? But so we sort of say net zero is the whole of council problem. We say this is not net zero. A lot of the councils that we're working with are, you know, very large to very small, racing out, buying a couple of electric cars, parking them out at the front of the office, and then doing LinkedIn photographs as their transition to net zero. We think net zero is more about a very complex puzzle, and I think Gillian really, you know, demonstrated that very well, and that whole impact of the whole of council approach. So where are we? And I think people like yourselves are probably, we've sort of discussed that already. Many councils have got their LEDs in, they're using renewable energy and are conducting some carbon audits. But for many councils, I think we're starting the net zero journey. So one of the points of having a framework is understanding, is being able to answer that question a little bit more precisely. So councils are preparing net zero action plans. We see that. We see finance preparing long-term financial plans, and we see assets preparing 10-year replacement programs in councils. But it's a little bit each business unit doing its own thing, not necessarily a whole of council approach. And without a whole of sector approach, let's just forget about whole of council, whole of sector. We don't want to go through a process of reinventing the wheel or diminishing our overall effectiveness, and not taking the opportunity to learn from each other as easily, and really even benchmarking to see where are we in comparison to our colleagues in the journey. And that can help for a whole lot of reasons. So whole of council approach was a question, or piecemeal. Are we just going to buy a few cars? And, you know, a lot of the small councils, rural councils we deal with, even large rural regional councils, you know, really still at that sort of piecemeal level. So whole of council or whole of sector, and what does that look like? So how confident are we that our current net zero practices are financially sustainable and, to pick up on Wayne's point, permanent? Like they're embedded into the system. How do we compare with similar councils? Do we have adequate strategy and plans to manage our net zero requirements? Are there regional net zero opportunities to work collaboratively with neighbouring councils? And have we adapted our asset management plans to accommodate the net zero aspirations? So these are all questions that we've thought about as a company, but we certainly, not sitting here today saying we've got the answer to those questions, but we think they're worth posing in a forum like this and getting some feedback. A net zero framework can provide, several benefits: a clear pathway to net zero, a road, a definite roadmap at Sunshine Coast, set goals, create a plan of action, improve environmental performance, reduce energy consumption, increase use of renewable energy, reduce waste, improve reputation. I think, as John said earlier on, the public companies are getting pressured. It won't be long before the councils. I have people in the gallery in question time saying, "What are you doing? What are we doing as a council to assist our community move towards net zero?" Compliance, innovation. What sort of benchmarking are we going to do, and between us as council? So we're and what's the improvement or the changes to asset management? If we're talking about investing in waste management sites, we're talking about fleet, we're talking about buildings. A lot of these areas are funded and developed through asset management plans. So what are those changes? So I'll leave that there. And what I was going to do now is just stop sharing that one. Stop presenting. And I'll go and pick up the framework and show you what that would potentially look like. So can everyone see that?
Yep, got it.
Right. So this framework basically is set up council by council, and it's built around what we used to call the STEP program, and we now call AMCAP, where we go out and facilitate and sit down with councils, and we spend 2 or 3 hours talking about how council's progressing across various elements of net zero. So for example, we have, and really this needs a team of people with far more expertise than I have to sit down and design and get the questioning right, get the elements right. But just as a guideline, just forget about the content at the moment. We use this to basically to go through and assess across 5 or 6 key criteria and start to get a bit of a where is council? Oh, it's minimal, we're moderate, and what are our improvement opportunities? And then we have over here evidence required to show that we have, if we're completed or we're well developed, the consultant would be able to assess and see the evidence to support that outcome. So we set this up across, have we got a strategy, annual budget? What's our budget? Because the amount of councils I would go into, or our teams would go into, and we see these lovely net zero plans, and particularly around plant and fleet. And then we say to the council, where's the budget in the asset management plan to actually make the transition to the green fleet, or to the whatever your aspiration is? And quite often these strategic plans have a lot of aspirations in them, but when you get down to the budget, there's no money funding them. So it's it's not even permanent. It's not even going to start. So annual report, what are we doing for reporting back to our community? So what's our action? We're a level of government. How do we report back? So what are our targets? How are we going? And we can put a response in there. And this is just a section on what the targets are and so on. But rather, I don't want to concentrate on the content. So basically, that's a bit of a facilitated session. We would then move into a session on the asset management plans, because to me, that's where the funding's got to come through for changes, if we're going to change fleet, change lighting, change building design, change, it's all got to be maintained, operated, renewed. So it's got to be budgeted. It's got to be, we've got to make sure we've got people who understand how the stuff works and all the rest of it. So the asset management plan to me is a key cornerstone, a key document where the money, part of the money should be going. It's not all about asset management, as you know, but a large part of the implementation is. Core report card then, this is sort of stuff that you can start to show to the community, and each council can see where they're strong, where they're weak across the agreed criteria. And then, you know, a core maturity assessment that can be signed off by a chief executive officer and set the improvement plan in place. And then again, we have another example of, you know, some graphs that, you know, might accompany the assessment. So long-term financial plan, annual budget. So it's no point us having aspirations, goals, strategies, policies, documents flying around the office everywhere if we haven't got funding in budgets and long-term plans, if we haven't got asset management strategies and plans adjusted, because they're going to have, that's where council's rubber hits the road. That's where council has to make a difference. Therefore, money and effort and training and reskilling and reshaping how we address these issues needs to be funded, monitored, reported against. So these, if they had graphs in them, would show you where they're at each plan, and that's just the council group. So it's just an idea that we've discussed as a company, thinking about, should there be a national what we would call net zero assessment framework. Now, one of the other benefits of this too is that we can, when we're talking to politicians who like to fund us, we've got grants, we've got leverage, we've got, when we want to do investment beyond borders, we can act regionally through a framework, get funding, and actually year by year show an improvement in how the sector, how an individual council can show how it's improving, and then as a sector level we can show improvement in our net zero objectives and goals. So the idea is just there on the table, and CT doesn't hold itself out to have significant net zero or environmental credentials, but we believe that obviously as the sector evolves into these types of changes, we'll have to evolve our learning and knowledge, and we just feel that by the sector managing and monitoring its current state of knowledge and demonstrating improvement over time, that it could be a valuable approach, particularly and also for those very small councils. They're able to learn, create connections with the likes of Gillian and others who are very knowledgeable and can assist them as well. So we actually lift the focus away from the necessarily just the municipality I live in to the region, the state, the sector that we all belong to. This was very successful with asset management and really lifted the sector's performance and knowledge across a period of 15 years. And I just believe this something like this would be relevant and facilitate learning, and also be a great document to assess our performance and improvement over time. So I might just leave it there, John.
Michael, thank you. What we might do is just continue with what Michael's presented and invite some comment from the participants. So please feel free to raise your hand and let us know that you're interested in making a comment, and then we'll ask you to turn on your camera and to ask the question. Cecilia, please join us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cecilia Kemp. I'm the Net Zero Officer for the Canberra Region Joint Organisation. We are a group of 11 member councils, and I've been fortunate enough to be funded from the New South Wales State Government's Sustainable Councils team to actually do exactly what Michael's kind of just run through, which is to assist those 11 member councils in developing their pathway plans. But the first step will definitely be to create a baseline survey or to undertake a baseline survey. Now we have pieced together a very basic version of what Michael just showed us. Hence my question in the chat, if there was anybody from the Sustainable Councils team online here, because it would be pretty awesome for them to have a conversation with you, Michael, and for you to demonstrate the detail in your spreadsheet compared to what we've created, because we don't want to overcomplicate things. I think a lot of councils, particularly the small regional ones, do get very overwhelmed. So I have my top 5 approach, which is literally electricity contract, landfill, fugitive emissions, wastewater treatment, fugitive emissions. Which one am I missing here? Gas, like so assets, and there's probably really fleet, obviously, and then offsets, past that. And so I'm trying to kind of keep the communication with the councils as simple as possible. But at the end of the day, long term, we need to obviously have very rigorous reporting frameworks in place. So yeah, I think it would just be a really great conversation for you to have with that entity. So I'm happy to do an intro.
That'd be great, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you.
While we've got you, you mentioned that it's the role's funded by the state government, and it's a role that's been duplicated across the sector with various joint organisations of councils.
Correct. There are 9 joint organisations and ROCs funded from the Climate Change Fund to trial this method of delivery of support.
Excellent. And how are you finding the starting points for your 11 member councils? Are you finding that their starting points are in fact all over the place?
Oh yeah. It's been really interesting and so lovely, but fascinating. Out of the 11, 4, for instance, have PPAs. I'd say again 4, but actually slightly different. 4 have do really good monitoring of their emissions. But so many of the other ones barely even have a team member who's responsible for these things. So I'm really pleased. I've got my little working group, so at least I've got a representative to talk to at each council.
And I think, Cecilia, a sort of a framework assessment, if you like, should tell the truth. And we're starting from -3 or wherever we are, and then over time we're tracking that improvement. So these frameworks really come into their own after a period of time. You can see that improvement. You can see the rate of improvement at each place. And as long as there's expertise around what we're trying to monitor, measure and manage, we can set this thing up to be quite powerful, and also to put in front of funding agencies for particular help with fleet across the 9 councils, or particular help with whatever the priority is. But it's elegant in terms of its presentation, and it can say a lot in particularly when you get that time factor.
And I assume that, if we went through the spreadsheet, we could have a look in more detail at some point, but that the answers are not subjective, because I think that's the hard thing sometimes with assessment tools, is that it really is up to the individual entering the data. So you have to make sure there's the consistency every time you undertake the assessment.
And that's part of the process, setting up what, if you say this, that means you've got this in place. And that's where we need the expertise.
Yeah,
But
fantastic.
to set that up properly, get agreement amongst the group to do that. So they set the benchmarks, and then when it's measured, it's clear where we all were at. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cecilia, just before I let you go, can I just get you to comment on the carbon literacy? What's the level of basic understanding across your 11 members, and how are you finding that in terms of identifying the need to raise awareness, educate, and train?
So I am really at the infancy of the project, so I'm only just starting those conversations. And to be fair, the people that I speak to are, you know, the people that have probably been fighting the good fight for a while. I just spotted Carly Hood on here, for instance. You know, like we've been doing this for quite some time, and so the literacy with my contacts is pretty good. However, I did present to the general managers of the joint organization the other day, and I realized I should never assume any form of baseline knowledge, right? And so I made sure there were a couple of slides at the beginning, just going, all right, this is the greenhouse gas effect. These are the main emission sources from local councils. I even made the point that, you know, we all think we're special, but actually all councils pretty much have the same emissions, unless, emission sources, not emissions, emission sources, unless, you know, one council doesn't have landfill, for instance, or, you know, one doesn't run their own water treatment plants or whatever. You know, there's always going to be slight differences, but, you know, you can probably summarize them, you know, on one hand, like I did before with my top 6 projects.
Cecilia, thank you so much for your contribution. Could I invite others to make any comment and or ask Michael any questions? Would you find the assessment framework useful in terms of your council, in terms of your region, and could you see the assessment being broadly used? Please feel free to use the raise your hand function, and then we'll invite you to turn on your camera and ask the question. No more questions, no more comments. Thank you. Now we've got a comment from where are we? We've got a comment from Carly Hood. Carly, would you be happy to turn on your camera and ask a question? And I think Gillian will be able to assist you with that. No, not working. Gillian, I'm assuming this is directed to you. Are you including your legacy landfill emissions in this? I'm assuming it's part of the data that you presented.
Yeah. So it's part of the emissions model, and we are lucky enough to have a commercial analysis section, and it's certainly part of the underlying data model. Because as you know, they all the emissions, they stay around for quite a while, so certainly legacy is included.
Thank you.
Oh, hang on, sorry. If you're talking about closed landfills, no. So that's a different question. So in relation to our active landfills, yes. So there was actually regulations that came out that I think landfills that had closed prior to 2012, they're not required to account for legacy emissions in your emissions boundary.
Thank you. Now, can I invite generally from the participants to ask any questions or make any comment with the panel members, with Gillian, Wayne, and Michael? Gillian, while the participants are getting their heads around the question, talk to us about data. And you made some comment about data. What we normally find is that that councils that there's no shortage of data in councils, but the main issue is the state, the condition that it's in, and more importantly, that there's not necessarily a reporting mechanism for the data that is collected, and therefore it's not necessarily used for the purposes that maybe it should be used. Would you care to talk to us about what you found in terms of the data in your organisation and how you've been able to mould it in a way that it's useful for you to identify some baselines, but more importantly to track your performance over time moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll do my best because our data guru, who is part of our team as well, it should probably be answering this. And also Roz is here as well from my council. And look, we've been working on this for quite a while, and it's not to put people off, but also we're a really large council, and often the systems that we've got, they're actually as a result of legacy, you know, amalgamations, de-amalgamations, you know, getting new platforms, you know, adding on things here and there. And so we actually have got a broader program of works being run by our digital information service group. And it's actually about putting in place an enterprise level data management platform. And it's a big deal. So it's actually, you know, doing that, like I said, that cleansing, doing the wrangling of the data. I mean, we had to do, so we were doing benchmarking every year around our emissions, and it was a highly manualized process. And we always got data from the different business areas. So, for example, from finance, from waste around waste quantities, although we did have a data model as well with respect to the emissions for waste, so that was okay. You know, we had to get a lot of the look at actually the, you know, it's actually your invoicing, you know, in relation to electricity usage or fuel. And it was actually pretty, it was pretty excruciating, to be honest. So yeah, but all I can say is you start with what you've got. And we did, as I said, we always had to augment it and actually adjust it to work out, you know, obviously fuel, you know, by under the protocols, the greenhouse gas protocols, there are emissions factors that you can apply and things like that. So it took us overall probably 5 years, and we're constantly still improving our data. So yeah, it's one of those things you probably need to work across council and have a few, you know, good people who actually do understand how to use data. And there's just sort of no way around it. And perhaps maybe it's something where you bring expertise in. However, sometimes the problem with that is you have to have a deep knowledge and look internal to the organisation. It's not okay just to add another platform or another system, you know, that sort of half is fit for purpose and not. So I'm not sure whether that was a very useful answer, but we sort of did the hard yards.
Thank you. Can I invite other questions, comments from the participants? So, Michael, please feel free to join us.
Can you hear me all right? So, Jill, what hopes the little old shire of little old shire out the back of Queensland got if they're not working regionally and part of a collaborative team? They're not going to have people with all that stuff that you just talked about.
No.
So
Yeah.
we all sort of kidding ourselves really as a sector if we don't get sort of state association or state government support around this stuff. I mean, you're obviously excellent, skillful, but the you know, and this is why when we go into councils, people we're busy, you know, we're busy with councillor, you know, councillor Bloggs wants the kindergarten painted, so we're all running off to have a meeting with him. So they're not focused on, they've got no capacity to focus. So this is why I'm saying a framework assessment regional level needs to be possibly led by somebody, and possibly the state associations even.
Yeah, Michael, on that, I actually did throw a comment in there, and I actually thought that framework that you put up was really useful, and for every level of government, to be honest. And it's interesting because we've just gone through a process with Queensland Government, and Queensland Government, they are doing, in fact, it's Donovan Burton with climate planning. I know that he does a lot of work across Australia, actually, in relation to governance assessments. So a very similar framework, actually, to the one that you have. And it is looking at the broader climate risk, whether it's emissions reduction, adaptation planning, but definitely looking at your governance processes and how you make decisions, asset management planning. So I agree totally. Those frameworks and organisational wide assessments are critical. And yeah, I think for the smaller councils, they're not going to get it done. So really, you do have to either have something that the state has actually pre-worked up, and or work in alliances with others.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Jill. Wayne, can I also bring you in? I know that similar to what's already been said, that councils will do their utmost to achieve their annual emission reductions, and then they'll look to some form of offsetting, and the challenge with some of that is going to be that they may not be in a position to offset in onshore, if I could say that, and then the challenge will be, well, how we're going to achieve this and honour the political commitments that our masters have made. Well, the only way we can do that is then to potentially look at some offshore offsets. As we've seen, this hasn't really worked out well for some councils.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, just before I answer that question, Michael and Gillian, you'll be thrilled to know that 20 years ago, when we were running Cities for Climate Protection, which is the precursor climate program for our sector, we had, and which I ran, students and interns routinely going down into the bowels of the council. I remember St Kilda Council, where I was working for a while, where they'd pull out paper bills and convert, kilowatt hours to carbon, and it's a freaking nightmare. So at least we're dealing in a mostly digital environment, because we were in the transforming, or the movement between the sort of 80s and 90s analog still, moving into the digital environment. And before that, so here's a real old one. So apologies for those of you who weren't born when I'm talking about this, but back in the 80s, I was part of a thing called CouncilNet, where I can remember installing the first internet systems in councils off the fax machine, because that was the only machine that had a clean line. We'd put in, a modem and sort of point east and hope that it would work. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is we've come a long way. And data management systems, which were the beginning of what we would do in our climate protection program, they're much more sophisticated. The sort of work you're doing, Gillian, and I know many other councils are doing, is way more sophisticated. And even, Michael, small councils which are struggling with resources can still do a lot. I'm a strong believer that we go from where we are rather than wait for, manna from heaven. There's a lot we can do, so we start with that. So having said all that, your question, I think, is around, emission reductions don't add up to zero, of course. Councils then get caught out. And unfortunately, the first answer to that really is to resist the political rhetoric of next year we will be net zero. Now, I know that, John, that's probably not what you want me to say, but I'm kind of brutal in this, that I think we need to keep people with a sense of hope and realism around climate action, which is so critical this century. Climate action and biodiversity action are the two great unfurling crises we have to act on. But to keep people focused on that, there's no good telling them stuff that we just have to bullshit them to get to the other end of them. There is a place for overseas emission offsets. There is a place for that, but it's not at $2 a tonne, I can tell you, which is what it was up until quite recently. It can't be done with all of the worries of greenwash and lack of additionality and permanence, let alone that many local governments will struggle at election time justifying to their ratepayers that a significant chunk of money has gone not just out of the ratepayers area, which is not unusual, but in fact overseas. Now, we live in a global system. Regardless of COVID, I think there is a new localism about, and I think that there's no avoiding that. So I think my advice, firstly, I know this might sound sort of terribly upper level, but the first advice would be to try and construct localized plans to be able to invest as much money locally as possible. I know, Gillian, I'm sure you're doing that in your area. Well, I know you're doing that in your area. I was just up recently in Ballarat, where there's a group of councils doing something similar here in Victoria, looking at opportunities, in fact, working with Judge Warung, even better, the traditional landowners of that region, which can bring together a whole lot of wonderful social outcomes for the community. So firstly, looking at that. Now, what does that look like practically? I reckon there's an enormous amount of land. So if we're looking at land-based offsets in particular, enormous amount of land that is being, so we're often asset rich and cash poor. We have the land, but we don't do anything with it. We're not sure what to do with it. And managing it as natural restoration with all the benefits that come with that, integrating it with a passive and active recreation approach as well. We're pretty good at passive and active recreation, you know, where you can throw the frisbee and have a picnic, but are we also providing access for habitat and helping to fund it via the sequestration component? Now, there are some constraints around that, very difficult to do in highly urbanised areas and probably on the Gold Coast really difficult, although we've planted up a fair bit around there as well. But I think, sorry, Sunshine Coast, you probably don't object to that, me saying Gold Coast. So I think the way I would propose this would be to be a strong advocate internally, to be humble in the ambitions, not to go out saying next year we're going to be net zero, because I think overreaching has been a major problem for our movement. What we need to be doing is demonstrating that this is achievable. Better to have a plan to get there by 2030, much as people will say, oh no, we can't do it, or 2040, whatever is relevant. Much better that than we promise next year and get there only because we go and buy 10,000 carbon credits overseas. So that would be my sort of initial approach. I think authenticity and maintaining hope. Here's the analogy for us in local government. For those of us in local government, I'm no longer in local government, would be the short term, the problems we've had with recycling in Victoria are going to have long-term consequences because we didn't plan for that. And I'm not attacking anyone in that, but we knew this was going to be a problem and we didn't plan for it. And then when it happened, we threw our hands up. And my view is that you're better off always thinking of the longer term, plan for the long term, not for the short term, try and get the politics to align around that. We all know how hard this is, but in terms of trying to get a solution, I guess, John, that is focused on long-term approaches that allow you to build infrastructure. So in that case, recycling infrastructure, but in this case, essentially ways to remove carbon locally and in collaboration with other areas that may have the opportunity to do it more cheaply in our catchment, for example. I think there's a real opportunity to do that in local government. And it probably needs some enablers to do it. State associations, by all means, the various other local government associations that are around, or maybe the bigger groups like Sunshine Council really going for it and demonstrating that can be done. But I think, as always, it's a pretty pragmatic sector. If it works, then other people will pick it up. And I think that's the way I would approach that problem.
Thank you for that, Wayne. And can I just encourage you one more time to either insert your questions, comments as part of the Q&A session, or raise your hand and we'll invite you to join us. Gillian, the climate emergency declaration, and that appears something that it sort of galvanizes communities and councils into action. I think you sort of alluded to that as part of your presentation. Was that a time when the organisation got serious about what it needed to do, and it acknowledged that something should be done, and focused the council's resourcing of the activity?
Yeah, so look, we originally started down this track around climate change. We actually developed one of the first climate change and people strategies back in 2008. And, we've been subject to the vagaries of politics as well. So there was obviously a de-amalgamation that occurred between ourselves and Noosa, I think, around about 2012. We also, I used to actually work at the Office of Climate Change, and I was one of the first people to get sacked by Campbell Newman, which I'm actually pretty proud of. So there was actually, things actually stalled for about 10 years, quite frankly, at both the state and federal level, and that really impacts local government. So that said, though, this council again really started pushing on it back in probably about 2015, and again with the development of our environment and livability strategy in 2017. And we were starting in that timeline. We were already starting to develop our zero net emissions plan, because we knew we had to get started on it, because with that long lead in time, we knew we weren't going to be able to turn this around quickly. And so there were a couple of things happening at the same time. The community here on the sunny coast really galvanised around the climate emergency, because there was a lot going again with, schools were going out on climate action, and there was a lot going on just broadly. And so it was actually really, I suppose, the impetus was actually with kids and with their parents, and they really lobbied our elected reps. And so we actually had one champion councillor who actually went, okay, I will take this, and he ushered the whole thing through within probably about a year of lobbying from the community, and ended up with getting the support of unanimous support of his 11 colleagues. So and that was in relation to, this is the decade of action. We need to take action now, and that in particular, one of the key pieces that was around that climate emergency resolution was that we had to accelerate our zero net emissions planning, which is what we did. So yeah, all the stars aligned pretty much.
Thanks, Gillian. And look, just a quick addendum to that. So in terms of funding, was the council happy to commit funding as a result of those various steps and decisions along the way, or is funding still an issue and a challenge?
Oh, look, it always is. However, that said, we absolutely, so our funding not only for adaptation, climate risk reduction, and also acceleration of more rooftop solar, because we actually demonstrated the benefit with respect to the payback periods very quick. So, and we established that through a revolving energy, renewable energy fund. And so we could actually demonstrate that, investment in this, when you looked at the life cycle analysis, was actually a no-brainer. So they certainly made, I think, probably about $800,000 immediately available to actually install more rooftop solar as one aspect. And then also with our climate risk work, they have been very generous in actually going, yep, we'll put our money where our mouth is.
Thank you. What I'll do, Gillian, I'll give you a few minutes to give some more thought, and then we'll get you to make some concluding remarks, and we'll finish up if there's no more questions. And similarly, Wayne, if you could give some thought to some concluding remarks, and we'll come back to you shortly. In the meantime, Michael, based on the various comments and feedback you've received in regard to the assessment framework, I'm assuming that that you'd be keen to potentially explore that with various councils who might be interested in participating in potentially even in a development and maybe even in a pilot.
Yeah, I think so, John. If people see it as valuable, and if you can assist the the smaller councils, and also assist with definitely with funding leverage, and also I think community engagement. I mean, if the community can sit there and see a presentation of where council's at, where council's advanced, where it's not advanced, and all the challenges, and ignite the local community with as well. I think that's the benefit of it. It tries to take get the complexities there, but it tries to present it in a sort of report card format. And then it's then designed, those improvement opportunities are then designed for each council within the benchmark group to get away and work at its individual level. And that picks up what Wayne said, just, we get on with something even as simple as getting our data sorted out or whatever. So, no, I think it's got benefit, but I'd love to have a group of councils to work with and some technical people to develop the pilot, develop the content, and then pilot the framework, and then put it in front of some of the decision makers at state association and state government levels. To say this is where the councils are at, this is the assistance they need.
Thank you, Michael. I like the idea, particularly around that it would actually inform some of the advocacy around funding requirements. Anything that sort of details the needs of councils in terms of both capacity building as well as capability, I think will go some way. I know that the Australian Local Government Association has been proposing as part of their budget submissions to the federal government a quite a modest amount of funding for councils as far as climate change is concerned. I think that we could certainly be a little bit more ambitious, and then this sort of data would certainly provide us with that opportunity to be more ambitious as we approach the various governments for support. Gillian, can I invite you? It doesn't look like we've had any more comments, and nobody's raised their hand. So what we might do is we might start to wrap up. So could I invite you to make some concluding remarks, and then we'll progress to Wayne and Michael to do the same, and we'll let everybody go.
Yeah, thanks, John. Look, I can't reiterate enough. It is a change management process, and don't think that is daunting. It's just a different way of how we've got to approach the issue, and it means you've got to talk across and with other people. Find your champions or like-minded people, and actually just start getting together and having the conversation. I think we underestimate the power of each of us to actually, get things moving, and often we sort of wring our hands and wait to be given permission or authorization from those above us to actually be doing things, when actually it's really starting the conversation. The other thing too for us, absolutely not ignoring that it's in very significant environmental benefits, but we started getting the attention, of decision makers when we talked about it as a business improvement process. And that they understand, they get, and also with risk reduction, which it primarily is as well. So you've got to talk their language. I think also those frameworks like Michael actually showed up, absolutely, they're really critical, because it's actually quite tricky to know where to start, and we just need to start somewhere. And I think we probably need to, as local governments, actually be better joined up and actually go with a common voice to our state counterparts, because often what we find that comes back from the state is not fit for purpose for local government context, and we need things that are going to work for our context. So are my key takeaways.
Thanks so much, Gillian. Wayne, would you
Thank you,
like
John.
to make some concluding remarks?
Yeah, I echo Gillian's comments. These are comments that I think are very apposite for the local government sector on so many levels. All the things you're talking about. So my three things that I would say is, notwithstanding Michael's heroic systemic efforts, and I appreciate how hard that can be, and I've been through a few life cycle assessment approaches, and we're going through this with nature-based offsets at the moment in Europe. There's a lot of work being done that is very much at the system level. I just urge people to start now. Notwithstanding, Gillian, I know it is difficult sometimes to pick what to work on, but there's lots of councils that have done work in all sorts of odds and sods, and I think starting and learning is a much better way of proceeding than planning for the next 5 years and everything's changed. So I'm a big proponent of starting straight away, while you still take action to think through the systems approaches. The second is, we haven't talked about here, but as was something we used to push many years ago, and I'm a really strong believer in, to trap savings. As Gillian and Michael both said, business improvement processes save money. So, and especially in resource conservation, the sort of work we're doing, which is often, unless there's been some recent work done, I could save money in any of the facilities most local governments run, just because of the nature of technology nowadays. So I think you want to trap those savings and ensure those savings are being reinvested in the more capital intensive areas. We all know this, and I know that's politically sometimes awkward, but that needs to be an upfront kind of principle that you lock in. Once you can do that, then you've got a capital fund, a revolving capital fund, and lots of examples over many years of councils that have done this very successfully. And I'm a big believer in it, because in our area we're talking about transforming the way to a low carbon economy. We need our job, in a way, is to leverage that a little bit harder. It'll happen, but it'll happen slower and more crisis driven than if we're able to think through and use this approach. And then lastly, notwithstanding the climate crisis that we are in and the difficult legacy my generation is passing on to the next, and I'm a granddad now, so that's a pretty exciting concept, thinking about what my little Henry's going to have to deal with when he's older. But I think we need to keep in mind that there is a second crisis, which is around biodiversity, and it links to a million other things, but in particular, climate change and biodiversity go together, and we can in fact create solutions that do both, that work on both. And I think, again, difficult though this often is, especially with geographical based sectors like local government, there's also enormous opportunities to take a leadership role in this area. So the linking of those two, I believe, will be the big movement in the 2030s. I think it'll be bringing those two, we're already seeing it a little bit, but it's not actually happening in decision makers. But I reckon next decade, decision makers, the sort of decision makers I speak to all the time, who are our supporters, from big companies like Telstra right down, I think that there's a real opportunity to get decision makers to focus on one solution for two major crises, and that's what we need desperately in our community. Thanks, John.
Thank you so much. Michael, could I invite you to make some concluding remarks?
Yeah, thanks, John. I agree with Wayne to a point. I don't think it's all about frameworks and strategies and plans and documents, but what I'm starting to see in local government is people doing things, but they're just the level of ignorance is still pretty high. I think, and I think a framework is about showing leadership. It's about educating. It's about getting agreement on what's important, what we're going to measure. It's about what's sustainable and permanent, to use your language, Wayne, as well. And it is also about the strong helping the weak, because there's a lot of large councils and a hell of a lot of small councils. And I think it also is a way of putting the information in front of the key decision makers, you know, ultimately saying to Albanese, if you're going to achieve 43% before 2050, you've got to take a hell of a lot of people along on a big journey. And as councils, we're responsible to take our communities along on a journey. So we need to communicate efficiently with our communities as well, and demonstrate where we're working, why we're working, and all the rest of it. So I think there is a place for a good framework. It needs to be technically competent. It needs to be a leadership document, and it needs to, you know, invite that community to make that change, because that's where the final solution sits, within the communities themselves. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Look, I'll just quickly wrap up. The NetZero Roundtable series of online forums will be ongoing. So this is first in a series. We're looking at the following topics of power purchasing agreements, community batteries, microgrids, electrifying council operations, waste and the circular economy, and mobilising the community. So each of those will be separate themes that we'll be bringing. The next session, and stay tuned for the announcement of the date, will be on EVs and charging infrastructure. So with the announcement last week of the federal government's release of the national EV strategy, it comes very timely for our next discussion. So when I return from Europe in July, I'll let you know when the new date will be for the next session. An event like this doesn't just happen. There are a number of people involved without whom it wouldn't be possible. And firstly, may I thank the three presenters, Gillian, Wayne, and Michael. Thank you so much for your informative and insightful presentation. It's been great, and we really appreciate it. And as I've mentioned, we're recording these sessions and we'll make them available as part of a resource back to the sector. Thank you also to CT Management, our event partners, Michael and Merv. Thank you so much for your support. We finally got there. It started off as a face-to-face event, and here we are many months later as an online forum, but we haven't given up yet. And finally, a big thank you to Jenny for her support in putting together the session, and also to Grant Andrews from Unico for his ongoing support and encouragement. Thank you to all the participants that attended the session. We hope that you got what you needed from the session, and we look forward to your future participation. Thank you so much for your time. All the very best. We'll let you go now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.